He saw his ex in the park with 3 little girls, then realized they all looked exactly like him. Michael Blake didn't usually take weekends off, but something about that morning pushed him out of his office and into the chilled, open air of Central Park. He walked briskly, dressed in a tailored black suit and silk bow tie from an early brunch event, his brown hair neatly styled and his piercing blue eyes half hidden behind sunglasses. His mind was drifting between quarterly numbers and an upcoming acquisition deal when, suddenly, something broke through his focus. A woman sitting on a bench caught his attention, not because she was loud or out of place, but because she was familiar in a way that stopped him cold. It was Emily. She hadn't changed much. Her blonde hair still cascaded in gentle waves, her posture still elegant, and her eyes, those same clear blue eyes he used to know intimately, now watched 3 small girls chasing each other through the grass nearby. The girls were dressed in matching white dresses that fluttered in the breeze, and they looked so alike it was almost disorienting. At first glance, Michael assumed they were triplets, maybe 5 years old, each with chestnut brown hair and eyes the exact shade of his own. His heart slowed, then raced. He froze in place, his breath catching painfully in his chest. The scene was too precise, too uncanny. They laughed, twirled, and ran, their faces lit with the carefree joy of children who knew nothing of the weight behind the man now staring at them. One of the girls fell, and Emily rushed over, scooping her up gently, whispering something that made the child giggle again. It was maternal, instinctive, and it was real. Michael couldn't move. The past crashed into him all at once, his angry words the night he told Emily to leave, the accusation that ended everything, the silence that had stretched for 5 unbearable years. He had told himself she'd moved on, that she hadn't wanted children, that if she had, he would have known. But now, faced with 3 little girls who looked undeniably like him, his carefully constructed beliefs shattered without mercy. He watched for several minutes, paralyzed. He saw himself in their movements, the tilt of a chin, the furrow of a brow, the dimple that only appeared on the right side when one of them laughed. It was too much. He turned, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel path, and walked quickly in the opposite direction, not ready to face her or the truth. His heart pounded in his ears, echoing one single, terrifying question: were those girls his? By the time he reached the edge of the park, he felt as though his world had shifted beneath him. The cold air bit at his face, but it didn't clear his thoughts. He pulled out his phone, stared at the black screen, and tried to breathe. For a man used to control, clarity, and dominance in every sphere of his life, this moment felt like a fall he hadn't seen coming. He needed answers. He needed truth. But more than anything, he needed to see them again, to look into their eyes up close and know, without doubt, what his heart already suspected. And so, the next move wasn't about business. It wasn't about pride. It was about something far more fragile. It was about a past that wasn't finished with him. It was about 3 little girls in white dresses. And it was about Emily, the woman who may have kept a secret so big, it had the power to rewrite everything he thought he knew about himself. The following morning, Michael sat alone in his office, surrounded by the same expensive silence he had come to rely on over the years. The view from the glass tower stretched across Manhattan, but for once, it brought him no comfort. His phone lay untouched on the desk. His laptop screen was still open on yesterday's financial reports, but the numbers meant nothing to him. His thoughts were consumed entirely by what he had seen in the park. He could still hear their laughter echoing in his ears, see the way their small hands had reached for Emily, the way one of the girls had tilted her head exactly like he did when he was deep in thought. There were too many similarities to deny. He hadn't slept. He had barely eaten. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. It wasn't just the possibility that they were his children that unnerved him, it was the realization that he might have missed the first 5 years of their lives. The first steps. The first words. The scraped knees, the tears, the bedtime stories. Things that couldn't be replaced, no matter how much money or power he had. It terrified him, because if they were his, then what kind of man had he become to abandon them without even knowing it? Michael reached for his phone. His hand hovered. What would he even say to her? Emily, the woman he had once loved deeply but pushed away in a single night of fury and pride. The accusation had been sharp, unforgiving. He had looked her in the eye and said, "I know what you did." He hadn't given her time to explain. He hadn't asked for proof. He had simply walked away. And she, wounded and too proud to beg, had vanished from his life without another word. Until yesterday. Until the moment she reappeared, surrounded by 3 girls who might carry his name, though they had never spoken it. He knew he had to see her. He couldn't live in limbo. So he made a decision, one that felt heavier than any corporate deal he had ever negotiated. He called an old private contact, someone discreet, someone who owed him a favor. Within hours, he had an address. She hadn't left the city. She lived on the east side, in a modest walk-up building he never would have imagined her choosing. That alone told him how much had changed. That evening, he stood across the street from her apartment, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in something plain, jeans, a dark sweater, no watch, no intention of hiding behind wealth. Her window was lit. He could see faint shadows moving behind the curtains. It took him almost 20 minutes to build the courage to walk to the door. And even then, when he finally rang the buzzer, part of him hoped no one would answer. But she did. Emily opened the door slowly, cautiously. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. The years fell away, but the weight of what they carried remained. She looked older, yes, but not in a tired way. She looked stronger. Steadier. And maybe that was what stunned him most. She hadn't fallen apart. She had built something in his absence. "Hi," he said, the word barely audible. Emily didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, she stepped back and said, "Come in." He entered the apartment and took it in with a kind of reverence. It was small, lived in, but filled with warmth. There were books stacked in corners, children's shoes by the door, colorful drawings taped to the refrigerator. The kind of home that spoke of love, not luxury. He saw a photo on the shelf, Emily with the girls, all smiling in a burst of laughter, their hair messy from the wind. No trace of him anywhere. The girls were asleep, she told him. He nodded, not sure whether he was relieved or disappointed. They sat at the kitchen table, and the silence between them was thick with unfinished history. Finally, he said the only thing that mattered. "Are they mine?" Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, very softly, she said, "Yes." He felt the breath leave his body. Not in anger, not in regret, but in sheer disbelief. He had known, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of emotion through him he couldn't name. He wanted to ask 100 things, but instead he whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked down at her hands. "Because you didn't believe me when it mattered. You pushed me out. You made it clear I had no place in your life. And I didn't want to fight you while carrying 3 children alone." 3. He repeated the number in his head. His daughters. A trio of lives he had helped create and yet never touched, never held. "I didn't know," he said. Emily's voice was quiet but firm. "You didn't want to know." He couldn't argue with that. And it broke him more than he expected. "Can I see them?" he asked. "Will you let me meet them?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Not tonight. They're asleep. But tomorrow, maybe." It wasn't a promise. But it was a start. And in that small kitchen, beneath the soft hum of a city that hadn't stopped moving, something shifted between them. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something fragile and possible. He left with trembling hands and a heart heavier than it had ever been, not because of failure, but because for the first time in years, he saw a chance to make things right. The next morning arrived with a pale gray sky and the kind of quiet that made everything feel more serious than it should. Michael woke early, but he hadn't truly slept. He had gone over every word from his conversation with Emily the night before, playing it on repeat in his head like a confession he hadn't fully earned. His daughters were real. 3 of them. Born into a world where he had been absent not because he died, not because he was stolen from them, but because he chose silence over trust. The weight of that decision followed him like a shadow as he dressed in simple clothes again, grabbed a box of books and puzzles he had purchased on the way home, and drove to Emily's apartment with his hands clenched on the steering wheel. Emily answered the door looking cautious, but not cold. She stepped aside to let him in without a word. Inside, the girls were awake. He could hear them giggling from the other room, a sound so light and innocent it made his eyes sting unexpectedly. Emily led him to the living room and said, "They know you're coming. I told them your name. That you're someone important." Michael nodded, trying not to overthink what that meant. Before he could say anything, the girls came running in. 3 of them. Identical in size and movement, yet each had subtle differences. One had a tiny birthmark on her chin, another wore her hair in a loose braid, and the third had a slightly more serious expression that reminded him sharply of himself. All 3 paused when they saw him. They didn't look scared. Just curious. Observing. Measuring. He crouched down slowly, his heart pounding. "Hi," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm Michael. I'm your dad." None of the girls responded right away. The one with the braid stepped forward, narrowing her eyes. "You're really our dad?" she asked, her tone direct, challenging in a way that made him both smile and ache. "I am," he said. "And I'm really sorry I wasn't here before. But I want to be here now. If you'll let me." The one with the birthmark looked at Emily, who gave her the faintest nod. She stepped forward too, then reached for the box in his hands. "What's that?" Michael opened the box and showed them the books and puzzles. "Just some things I thought you might like. I didn't know exactly what you're into." "Unicorns," said the third girl, the quietest one, her voice barely above a whisper. "And rainbows. And dinosaurs." He laughed gently. "That's a great mix." The girls sat on the floor, beginning to pull things out of the box, examining each item with fascination. Emily stood back, watching silently, her arms folded but her expression softer than it had been the day before. Michael lowered himself to the floor too, not caring about the expensive jeans or the ache in his knees. He watched them, listened to them talk over each other, argue about which puzzle to start first, and he felt something shift inside him, a place that had been numb for years slowly beginning to wake up. For the next hour, he stayed on the rug with them, helping with pieces, reading bits of books out loud, answering their endless questions. "Do you live in a castle? Can we come in your car? Are you famous? What's your favorite color? Why didn't you know us before?" That last question cut through him like a knife. He looked into the eyes of the girl who had asked, and he didn't dodge. "Because I made a mistake," he said. "A big one. And I didn't know how to fix it. But I want to now. I want to learn how to be a dad. Your dad." She seemed to consider that, then quietly handed him a puzzle piece. It was shaped like a corner. It didn't feel like forgiveness, but maybe it was a beginning. Eventually, Emily brought in some juice and snacks. The girls swarmed her, but 2 stayed close to Michael, as if they were testing the idea of proximity. He looked up at Emily and said, "They're amazing. You did an incredible job." Her face didn't soften, but her eyes did. "I had to," she said. "There was no one else." "I want to change that," he said. "Not just for them. For us. Whatever that means." Emily didn't answer, but she didn't shut the door either. That was more than he had any right to expect. When it was time for him to leave, one of the girls hugged him without being asked. The other two followed, hesitantly but willingly. Michael stood there at the door, stunned by the small arms around his waist. He looked at Emily, overwhelmed, and she just said, "Same time next week?" He nodded. "Or sooner. If they want." "They do," she said. "I think they already do." As he walked out into the cold air again, the city looked different. Softer. Slower. And for the first time in years, Michael felt like he was stepping not into a future he had built, but into one he had been gifted, one he never expected, but would never let go of again. Michael arrived the following Saturday with a different kind of nervous energy coursing through him. He had spent the entire week thinking of the girls, of the way their tiny arms had wrapped around him at the door, of the question one of them had asked that still echoed painfully in his mind, "Why didn't you know us before?" There was no way to undo the years he had missed, but he intended to be there for every moment moving forward, even the smallest ones. He carried with him not just another box of books and art supplies, but also something more personal, a framed photo of himself as a child, around the same age as the girls. It had taken him days to find, tucked away in his mother's old storage. He wasn't sure why he'd brought it, only that he wanted them to see that he too had once been small, wide-eyed, and uncertain of the world. Emily opened the door and didn't even ask why he was early. She simply let him in, her gaze meeting his in that way it always had before everything between them cracked. The girls were in the living room, curled up together on the couch watching a cartoon about space. One of them noticed him first and instantly lit up. "Daddy's here," she shouted, and the words, still unfamiliar, still foreign and sacred, made his chest swell and ache all at once. He sat down on the floor again without being asked, placing the photo frame carefully beside him. One of the girls pointed to it immediately. "Who's that?" "That's me," he said. "When I was your age." They studied it like scientists examining a discovery. "You look like us," one of them said matter-of-factly, and he laughed quietly. "That's because you look like me," he answered, and their eyes widened just a little. It was a small moment, but one that stitched a thread between past and present, proof of a bond none of them had chosen but all of them had been born into. Later, while the girls painted pictures at the kitchen table, Michael and Emily sat nearby, sipping tea. She looked tired but content, and he watched her as she gently helped one of the girls clean paint off her hands. There was grace in everything she did, no rush, no resentment. Just patience. Michael took a deep breath. "I want to file for joint custody," he said quietly. Emily didn't look at him right away. She finished helping the girl, then turned to him, her face unreadable. "I'm not trying to take them," he added quickly. "I just want to be in their lives legally. Permanently. I don't want it to depend on how you feel about me one day or how things go between us." Emily folded her hands. "Do you understand what that means? You'd be legally responsible for everything, school decisions, medical issues, all of it." "I want that," he said. "I want the responsibility. I want to earn it." There was a long silence. Finally, she nodded. "We'll talk to a lawyer." He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until that moment. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't even a breakthrough. But it was progress, and for Michael, it felt enormous. He spent the rest of the day taking turns with Emily reading to the girls, letting them climb on his back like a jungle gym, and answering endless questions about his life. He told them about his favorite ice cream, about the time he broke his arm as a boy, about the old dog he once had who used to chase mailmen. Each answer pulled them a little closer. Each story made him less of a stranger. As the sky darkened, Emily made dinner and invited him to stay. They ate together around the small table, the girls talking over each other, making jokes only they understood. At one point, one of them reached over and gently wiped some sauce off Michael's chin with a napkin, just as casually as if they'd been doing it all their lives. Emily watched the moment without comment, but her eyes glistened. When it was time to say goodbye, The girls wrapped their arms around his legs, their voices unified in protest. "Don't go yet." "I'll be back," he promised, crouching to hug each one individually. "And we'll do something fun next weekend. Just the 5 of us." 6, one of them corrected, nodding toward Emily. Michael met her eyes. She smiled faintly, but said nothing. It was more than enough. As he walked out into the winter evening, snow beginning to fall lightly onto the pavement, Michael realized something startling. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man defined by what he had lost. He felt like a man learning, moment by moment, how to belong again, not to a company, not to an empire, but to a family he never knew he'd needed this much. The process of filing for joint custody was more complicated than Michael had expected. Not because Emily made it difficult, she didn't, but because the legal system didn't work on emotion or guilt. It worked on evidence, structure, consistency, and a documented commitment to the children's best interests. Michael had hired the best family attorney in the city, a quiet but relentless woman named Karen, who had told him point blank during their first meeting, "You need to prove not that you're wealthy or sorry, but that you are indispensable to your daughters' lives. They will ask what kind of father you are, not what kind of man you used to be." That statement stuck with him. It forced him to reflect on the version of himself that had existed before Emily left, before the park, before those 3 little girls had come into focus. That man was a ghost to him now, untouchable, powerful, disconnected. He hated that man. Each week, he made himself more available. He adjusted meetings. He cancelled high-profile business lunches. He started taking the girls to dance classes, doctor appointments, and birthday parties with kids he'd never met. He bought a booster seat for his car, learned the names of every stuffed animal they owned, and became fluent in the strange, whimsical logic of 5-year-olds. The girls began calling him Daddy consistently. Sometimes Dad when they were distracted, and Dada when they were tired and clinging to his shirt. It never stopped hitting him like a wave every time. He kept every drawing they made. He memorized their favorite colors. He learned who cried first when one of them got hurt, who hated carrots, who pretended to fall asleep first but never actually did. Emily watched him quietly during these weeks. She didn't praise him out loud, but she didn't stop him either. She gave him more space, more time, more trust. On weekends, they often spent time together as a group, going to museums, walking in the park, eating messy burgers in paper baskets at food trucks. It felt like something impossible was happening, not a reunion in the romantic sense, but the slow forming of a family out of dust and old silence. One night, after a long day at the aquarium, they all ended up back at Emily's place. The girls fell asleep on the couch, heads pressed together like petals on a flower. Michael helped Emily clean up the kitchen, wiping glitter and cookie crumbs off the counter, and then lingered, unsure if he should leave. She didn't say anything at first, just handed him a towel and motioned toward a pan she'd forgotten in the oven. He pulled it out, turned off the light above the stove, and finally said, "I feel like I'm always on the edge of asking for too much." Emily turned and looked at him with something tired but open in her eyes. "Because you're afraid to lose again." "I already lost. This, all of this. I didn't expect a second chance. Not from you. Not from them." She nodded slowly, then walked into the living room and adjusted the blanket around the girls. When she came back, she leaned against the counter beside him. "You are doing everything right, Michael. But part of me still wonders, why now? Why not then?" He didn't have a clean answer. He just said, "Because I was selfish. I thought being right mattered more than being kind. I thought winning was love. And it wasn't. I see that now. I don't expect you to forget, but I hope one day you'll believe that I've changed." She stared at him for a long time. "They believe it," she said finally. "And honestly, I think I'm starting to as well." The following week, they had their first court appointment. It wasn't a trial, just an official discussion with the family mediator, a woman named Dr. Reynolds who sat with a thick file and a long list of observations. She spoke with Emily first, then with Michael alone. He answered questions about his job, his intentions, his long-term plans for the girl's education and emotional well-being. He told the truth, that he was terrified of repeating his mistakes, that he had never been more committed to anything in his life. Later, they sat together in the room while Dr. Reynolds spoke directly to them both. "It's rare," she said, "to see two people who've gone through this much come back to the table like this. If you continue on this path, I see no reason why shared custody shouldn't be approved." Michael felt something loosen in his chest, something like hope, but steadier. That night, back at his penthouse, still cold and polished and painfully empty, he stood in the hallway staring at the single crayon drawing taped to the wall. It was crooked, full of uneven stick figures, but he knew exactly who was who. One of the girls had labeled it with their names, Daddy, Mommy, me, me, me. He stared at it for a long time before picking up the phone and calling his real estate agent. He didn't want a penthouse anymore. He wanted a home with stairs and messy shoes by the door. He wanted a room with bunk beds and crayon on the walls. He wanted a place where they would never have to wonder if he was coming back. Michael Blake had finally begun to understand that fatherhood wasn't just a role, it was a lifelong promise, and he intended to keep it. By spring, the rhythm of Michael's life had transformed completely. Gone were the sharp edges of boardroom tension, the late nights sealed off in glass towers, and the constant hum of ambition that had once driven him to believe he was untouchable. In their place were soft footsteps down a hallway lined with drawings, the laughter of little girls echoing through his newly purchased suburban home, and the sound of morning cartoons playing in the background while he packed lunchboxes filled with small sandwiches and peeled apples. He had moved into a quiet neighborhood just 20 minutes from Emily's apartment, and even though they still lived separately, the shift was undeniable. The girls now had bedrooms in two homes, not just one, and in both places they felt safe, heard, and wanted. Michael had chosen the house not for its size or finishes, but for the tree in the backyard where they could hang a tire swing, and for the windows that let in golden afternoon light perfect for reading. He filled their rooms with soft blankets and stuffed animals, picked out matching butterfly nightlights for each bed, and carefully pinned up their first drawings, no longer on office walls, but where they could see them every day. He didn't decorate like a man trying to impress. He decorated like a father making room for something sacred. Weekends became sacred, too. He picked up the girls on Friday evenings and returned them to Emily on Sunday afternoons, unless they had all planned something together. On some weekends, they baked together, flour covering every surface of his once pristine kitchen, and on others, they camped out in the living room, building pillow forts and watching movies with popcorn balanced on their laps. He learned how to braid hair, clumsily at first, but now with growing confidence, and began to recognize the small signs of when one of the girls was upset or hiding something behind a smile. He learned to be quiet when they needed silence and silly when they needed to forget something hard. Emily visited often. At first, only for pickups and drop-offs, but eventually for dinner, then coffee, then to sit on the porch and talk while the girls played in the yard. The conversations were careful at first, as though they were afraid to lean too far into anything meaningful. But slowly, the walls thinned. They began to speak honestly, even about the past. Emily admitted how hard it had been, pregnancy alone, nights pacing the floor with 3 crying infants, no one to call, no hand to hold. She didn't tell it to accuse him. She told it because she needed him to know what she had carried so that he would understand what they were building now. Michael listened without defense. He didn't interrupt or justify. He simply took it in. When she told him she had considered leaving the city altogether, but something stopped her, he asked softly, "What stopped you?" And she looked at him and said, "I think I always hoped you'd come back. Not the man I left. The one you used to be. The one I loved before the fear and pride buried everything." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't an invitation. But it was a flicker of something real. Something possible. One Friday evening, after an unusually long week at work, Michael arrived at Emily's door to pick up the girls. He looked exhausted, his tie undone, sleeves rolled, and eyes heavy with the kind of weariness that came not from lack of sleep but from trying too hard for too long. Emily opened the door and studied him for a moment. "Why don't you stay here tonight?" she said. "They're already in pajamas, and I think they just want to curl up on the couch. I made stew. There's enough for two." He didn't answer right away, just nodded, and stepped inside. That night, the five of them sat together, tangled on the couch under mismatched blankets. The girls fell asleep slowly, one by one, until only Michael and Emily remained awake, surrounded by quiet breathing and soft lamplight. He looked at her and whispered, "I never thought I'd have this." She turned her head slightly. "Do you want it?" He didn't hesitate. "More than anything." She didn't answer. But she didn't look away either. And in that silence, Michael felt something settle, something heavier than happiness and lighter than forgiveness. It was the sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, not because of luck or redemption, but because he had shown up, again and again, for the people he had once walked away from. He hadn't earned their love overnight. But day by day, he was learning how to deserve it. As summer began to warm the city, the world around Michael felt like it was opening up. The girls were finishing their preschool program, and he attended their end-of-year celebration with pride he had never known he was capable of. He stood in the back of the small auditorium, watching them sing and dance on a makeshift stage, their voices off-key but full of joy, and tears filled his eyes without warning. When they spotted him in the crowd, all three waved wildly, breaking the flow of the performance just to make sure he saw them. He waved back, placing a hand on his chest, not to calm himself, but to hold something in place, something that had felt broken for too long but now pulsed with life again. After the celebration, they all went to the park. Emily brought sandwiches, and Michael brought ice cream. The girls ran ahead, giggling, barefoot in the grass, and for a moment, he and Emily stood side by side watching them in silence. There was no tension between them now, no awkward pauses or unfinished conversations. What existed now was something steady, almost peaceful, like two people who had lived through the same storm and somehow survived on the same raft. He turned to her and said, "I'm thinking about something. About us." Emily didn't speak, just raised an eyebrow slightly. He continued. "I don't mean rushing into anything. I wonder if maybe someday, when you're ready, we might all live under one roof." She looked at him, not with surprise, but with a kind of tired understanding. "It's not a small thing, Michael. This isn't just about us. It's about three little girls who've just started to trust you. And me too, in my own way." "I know," he said. "And I'm not asking for now. But maybe someday soon, we could talk about it." That night, after he dropped them off, Emily sent him a picture. It was a photo one of the girls had drawn that afternoon, a simple crayon sketch of a house. Inside were 5 stick figures. She hadn't labeled them, but Michael knew who they were. He stared at the image for a long time, then saved it to his phone and made it his home screen. Over the next few weeks, something even more remarkable happened. Emily began to stay longer when she visited his house with the girls. At first, she only helped with bedtime. Then she stayed for dinner. Then one night, she fell asleep on the couch with one of the girls curled against her side. Michael didn't wake her. He covered them both with a blanket and sat quietly beside them, watching the kind of domestic stillness that he once believed would never be his again. One weekend in July, they decided to take a small trip together. Just 2 days at a lakeside cabin outside the city. Michael was nervous, afraid that the closeness would bring back too much from the past, too much history, too much loss. But it didn't. It brought laughter and lazy mornings, board games on the porch, and the 3 girls squealing with delight every time he let them jump on him in the water. On the second night, after they'd gone to bed, he and Emily sat by the fire pit with mugs of tea, and she turned to him and said softly, "I think they're happy." He nodded. I hope they are. They are, she said. And not just because they have toys and books and bunk beds now. But because they feel loved. They feel safe. And they see us choosing them, together. He looked at her carefully. Do you? She held his gaze. I'm getting there. It was the most honest answer she could have given, and it meant more than any declaration. They didn't kiss. They didn't talk about the future with plans or promises. But in the shared silence, in the way she didn't move away when he gently touched her hand, Michael felt something grow between them. Not the fire they had once had, wild and fragile, but a steadier flame. One that could last. The next morning, as they packed up to return to the city, one of the girls tugged on Michael's shirt and said, "Daddy, I like it when Mommy's with us all the time." He knelt down beside her, brushed a curl from her cheek, and whispered, "Me too." And when he looked up, Emily was watching him. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Because in her eyes, he saw the truth, she was letting herself believe in him again. Not for the man he had been, but for the father, and maybe one day the partner, he was becoming. Autumn arrived slowly, painting the trees in shades of fire and gold, as if the world itself was ready to turn a page. Michael had never liked fall before, too quiet, too full of endings, but now it felt like a season of becoming. The girls were growing fast, each day unfolding with tiny milestones, reading their first full sentences, tying their own shoes, asking deeper questions about the world and about him. They called him Daddy without hesitation now. Their voices said it like a truth that had always existed, not one that had arrived late and uncertain. He had officially been granted joint custody. The court hearing had gone smoothly, mostly because Emily had stood beside him, calm and clear, telling the judge that Michael had not just shown up for the girls, but stayed, proved himself, and transformed in ways she hadn't expected. The judge had looked over at him with something close to approval, stamped the paperwork, and said, "Make the most of your second chance." Michael had never forgotten that phrase. He repeated it often to himself, sometimes when he was up at 2 a.m. cleaning up a spill, or when one of the girls had a nightmare and needed him to sit beside their bed until they fell asleep again. Life settled into a new rhythm. Michael worked less, but lived more. The girls were in his home almost half the week now, and their toys, drawings, socks, and songs filled every corner. He kept up his business responsibilities with fewer hours and a deeper sense of purpose. His colleagues noticed the difference. Some admired it. Others didn't understand. Michael didn't care. He had traded something sharp and cold for something warm and alive, and he had no desire to go back. Emily came over more often, but not out of obligation. She stayed for dinner without needing an invitation. She helped with homework, sat beside him during movie nights, and laughed again in a way he hadn't heard in years. They didn't talk about getting back together, not formally, not directly, but the space between them grew smaller, more natural. The girls noticed too. One night, as they were all cleaning up after a particularly chaotic dinner, one of the twins looked at them and said, "I think you should just live together again. It's easier that way." Michael and Emily both laughed, but when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. That night, after the girls were asleep, they sat on the back porch, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the leaves fall in the moonlight. He finally asked, "Do you think it's time?" Emily didn't answer right away. She leaned into him slightly, resting her head on his shoulder. "Maybe," she said. "But only if we build something new. Not what we had before. That's gone." He nodded slowly. "I don't want the old version of us. I want this one. The one we fought for. The one that has room for forgiveness and truth." She was quiet for a while, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "Then yes. It's time." 3 months later, they moved in together. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures. No official announcement. Just boxes stacked in hallways, furniture rearranged, and 3 little girls who ran around the house like they already knew it was home. Emily brought her plants, her books, her quiet strength. Michael brought patience, presence, and a kind of joy that he'd never had in his former life, the one with all the money and none of the meaning. They created new rituals. Sunday pancakes in pajamas, Friday dance parties in the living room, birthday banners hung the night before with glitter and tape. Michael learned how to be part of the small things, not just the big decisions or scheduled weekends. He learned that love wasn't a dramatic act, but 1,000 quiet ones. One evening, long after the girls were asleep, Michael stood in their hallway, looking at a new drawing taped to the wall. It was another picture of their family, but this time, all 5 of them were holding hands. Above it, the words in crooked block letters, home. Emily came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "They're happy," she whispered. He turned to face her. "So am I." She smiled and kissed him softly, not because it was planned, but because it was true. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the soft hum of the baby monitor, Michael felt the full weight of what they had survived: pride, betrayal, years lost to silence, and what they had rebuilt in its place. Not perfection. Not fairy tale. But something better, a real family, stitched together with mistakes and mercy and the willingness to begin again. And for the first time, he knew without doubt that the best parts of his story had only just begun. The ending of this story stands out because it earns its happiness without ever faking perfection. It's not a fairy tale, it's something more powerful. It's about growth, humility, and what happens when someone truly shows up, not just to apologize, but to stay. Michael's journey from cold, distant success to present, loving fatherhood is believable because it's messy. He doesn't get everything right, and he doesn't pretend to. But he tries, again and again, and that's what makes the final chapter so moving. What I appreciate most is that Emily isn't written as someone who simply forgives and forgets. Her strength lies in her boundaries, her resilience, and her choice to trust slowly, based on actions, not words. The story respects her pain and doesn't rush her healing. And the girls, full of energy, innocence, and intuition, are the ones who quietly steer the adults toward wholeness. This isn't just a redemption arc. It's a reminder that the people we become after loss and regret can be stronger, softer, and more true. The ending is shocking not because of a twist, but because of how much has changed in such an honest, grounded way. It leaves you with hope, not the naive kind, but the kind that says, even broken things, if tended with love, can become beautiful again.